At first glance, Brandon appears to be your typical 17-year-old. However, if you take a closer look, you'd see there's something slightly different, something extraordinary. Brandon is autistic. Autism is defined as a developmental disorder of variable severity that is characterized by difficulty in social interacting and communication, and by restricted or repetitive patterns of thought and behavior. Brandon was diagnosed with autism around the age of 3. Brandon was one of the most beautiful babies I'd ever seen. It was definitely love at first sight. I had a normal pregnancy and delivery with Brandon. He was 6 pounds 9 ounces. Beautiful baby boy. And up until a particular time in his life, his growth and development were okay. There was no need for concern from me nor his pediatrician. My mother was the first to realize that there was actually something not so right with Brandon. My mother was a very caring person. She was a very loving and attentive grandmother. She was also a very observant person. I remember it like it was yesterday when my mother first came to me and said, "Tisy, there's something wrong with your baby." And I told her I didn't see what she was talking about. And the following day, she came back to me and she said again, "Tisy, there's something wrong with Brandon. Don't you see that there's something wrong with Brandon?" We initially thought Brandon had problems with hearing. There were many times you would call out to him and there would be no response from him. And at the same time, you could come in and turn the radio up and he would grab his ears and begin to scream as if he was in pain. So we didn't know that that was actually a behavior that he was going through. But my mom saw this. We went from doctor's appointments to referrals to finally being able to get Brandon tested. By the time we were able to get Brandon tested, some typical behaviors of autism had already manifested themselves in him. He went from being a quiet baby to being really hyperactive. And if I would let him, he would stand in a corner for hours, jumping up and down and flapping his hands, making these noises. We later found out after we taught him to talk that those noises he was making were actually songs that he was singing. Brandon liked to balance himself on high objects like the back of the sofa or the arm of the sofa. He would do that throughout the day, routinely. He preferred to play with straws from the broom instead of toys. He also had this behavior called pica, where he preferred to put non-food objects in his mouth. There were times I found screws and rocks There was one time I even woke him up to find a piece of glass in his mouth, and we went around the whole house trying to see where this 3-year-old got a piece of glass from, a piece of broken glass. And the only thing I could come up with is that he may have gotten it from outside in between the times of us going in and out. Brandon also didn't sleep much. If he slept 2 hours out of 24, it was okay for him. And that was the one time I did seek out medications for him because he needed to rest. My baby's eyes would be so red sometimes and puffy from lack of sleep, but he kept going. And so I did seek out medications to try to help him sleep. Ultimately, they zombified him, and I took him off, and I never put him on another med since, because I would rather see him up and about than just sitting there and not being able to raise his head or even know he was in this world. Brandon would go on to be tested. One psychologist wrote she was unsure with the behaviors that Brandon had displayed, whether or not he was severely retarded or if he indeed had autism. She would later go on to write on her second assessment that Brandon indeed had autism, but on the severest level of the spectrum. I was also told that it was likely that Brandon would grow up as an adult and not be any contribution to society, and that he would always need someone to take care of him. Hearing something like that about your child is absolutely devastating. I felt like all of his hopes and dreams and aspirations and opportunities had been taken away from him. I felt like he would never get a chance to experience some of the most beautiful things in life, being a husband, being a father. It was a really difficult time for me and for my mom. I often tell people I cried 1,000 tears 1,000 times, and I did. I cried for my son. I cried for the journey that I knew he had ahead of him. But one day his pediatrician told me, she said, "Stop crying. Brandon has 2 things going for him. 1, we caught things early, and 2, he has a mother like you." With those words, I got off that floor. With those words, I put on my boxing gloves. With those words, I made a conscious decision to go to war with this thing called autism. It had come into our lives, but it was not Brandon's life. I don't remember getting a lot of negative response from the community with Brandon autism. I do remember having to leave events sometimes early because he would become a little anxious with the crowds and the noises. There was one particular time that I do remember where someone had said to me, "Oh, he needs his little behind whipped," or something like that. And oh, baby, that was a big no-no. I don't even remember what happened after that. I must have blacked out. But I'm sure a lot of moms with special needs kids can understand when I say that the most important thing is our babies and making them feel comfortable. And so sometimes we didn't even go places. But I do think that the community needs to open their eyes, especially the old school community needs to open their eyes to the fact that autism is here and autism is real, and it does affect our children. And instead of talking about what they need be, we need to address these situations and give these babies what they need so that they can thrive.
When I first found out about Brandon, I didn't really understand what autism was. But as I got a little older and I started to understand a little more about autism, it kind of made me sad because I know that the world can be a cruel place, and I didn't want him to have to face things by himself. And it made me feel like I needed to be his protector, like he needed me.
One day when Brandon was 3 years old and his sister 8, she saw him at the edge of the yard playing with something. No one knew what it was, but he kept running around this particular thing and walking up on it and backing off. And it was just the funniest thing to him. So she went down to investigate, and as she got closer to him, she realized that it was a snake. And without any hesitation, she went into this sprint where she quickly got to him and removed him from the danger that he had no perception of.
I don't remember worrying about getting bitten myself, but I just knew that I needed to get my brother away from this snake. And it turned out to be a poisonous snake.
It was then that we realized that we also had to teach Brandon things that he should fear and stay away from. So we went out and bought a number of things like plastic snakes and spiders and rats and things like that. And we would put them down in front of him, and we would run away from him or tell him to run, so he would know that these things were not okay to walk up on and play with and try to pick up. So yes, we had to also teach him things he should fear. But now when I think about it, I don't know if Brandon actually learned to be afraid when we were trying to teach him that. I think he may have just mimicked our reactions, which was still good because he did run away from things that could possibly cause him harm. But now he is definitely afraid of these things today. And I just thought I'd show this video because for me it's just hilarious. It only took a fraction of a fraction of hope, and we were ready to give it everything we had. To be honest, we didn't know where to start when teaching Brandon, but we soon found that it was best that we calm his behaviors and quiet him enough where we could actually get his attention. And once we did that, we went to speech. We taught him how to speak. And from speech, we went on to teaching him academics, his ABCs, his colors, and things like that. We started with Brand's behaviors. Brandon had this behavior where he jumped up and down and stared into space and made these noises. So we decided to start with getting him to sit in one place. So what we did was we got a chair and sat him in front of us. And every time he would attempt to get up to do that behavior, we calmly but proactively sat him back down to the point that he knew that that is what we wanted him to do. Then we moved on to the noises, and every time he attempted to make those noises, we would softly shush him. And he learned very quickly that we wanted him to sit and be quiet. And to get him to look at us instead of in space, I would just hold his little face in front of me and I would call his name. And sooner than later, he started responding, and he knew exactly what we wanted when we pulled that chair out. We wanted him to sit quietly and pay attention to us. When teaching Brandon, we found that consistency was key. Being proactive with Brandon was key. And I have to say again, we have to be very consistent with children when you're teaching them with autism. My Mom and I immediately went to work, and what we found was we had to start with his behaviors. And once we got some of those a bit under control, we had to teach Brandon how to talk. All he did was babble, and we had to show him how to take those babblings and form a sound. And we started off with a single sound. We worked our way up to two sounds. So with two sounds, we formed a word. And that is how we got Brandon to talk.
When I had you, I treat you bad, and all my days ago since you been away. Don't you know I sit around with my head hanging down, and I wonder who's loving you. I, 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 should I never ever made you cry? I go since you've been gone. Don't you know I sit around with my head hanging down, and I wonder who's been you.
So we went from babbling to teaching sounds of the alphabets to small, simple words to harder words to small, simple sentences to what we have today. Yeah, we did that. He did that. I wasn't going to put Brandon in school. If you have heard of saying, nobody will ever love you like your mother, well, I thought nobody would ever take the time and patience to teach my son like his mother. And I had told the principal that was at Lewis Adams Elementary, Miss Maggie Williams, I think it was Maggie, I know we called her MD Williams, that the worst thing I could do was come up to the school and go to my son's class, and he'd just be sitting there not learning while the rest of the class go on with class. I told her that was one of the worst things that could ever happen to me and the school. But she convinced me to at least let him come for a while, and I did, and it turned out to be one of the best decisions that I've made for Brandon. By the time Brandon entered school, he had become familiar with his numbers, colors, alphabets, and primary word list. His word list would also include some secondary words that he was very familiar with and was able to even spell when asked. He was even labeled by some friends as The Little Genius. Brandon's journey had just begun. He would go on to become an exceptional student. One incident, Brandon unknowingly to everyone around him had learned sign language by simply looking at pictures in one of his classes. He would absorb everything he saw and everything he touched. Once we were able to get through to Brandon, he was like a sponge. He just absorbed everything that he saw and heard. So we basically had to monitor him because he did develop a behavior called echolalia, where he would listen to something, memorize it, and repeat it. Brandon's social growth was a little slower than his academic growth. He found out early in life that sometimes his peers can be cruel. One day I was picking him up from school, and as I walked up to the cafeteria, I could hear him screaming, "No, please leave me alone." And as I got in there, I found my baby sitting there with spitballs in his hair, balled up paper all around him, and books all around him. And the rest of the students were sitting at the back of the cafeteria looking at him, pointing and laughing, all while having an adult sitting there watching it happen. That particular incident straight shattered my heart. And it was things like that, though it wasn't many, that stunted his social growth. But academically, he flourished. And that really brought a whole lot of hope to the people that loved him the most. My mother was diagnosed with breast cancer, and it is what ultimately, temporarily, laid her to her resting place. Through chemo and being sick, through radiation and being burned, she was still Brandon's biggest fan, and he knew that he was loved. And it's almost like he understood there was something going on, because on days she couldn't hold him, he would sit beside her and wrap his arms around her legs and just look up at her. Cancer had prevailed over my mother's body, but my mother was the victor over her spirit, over her faith, and over her belief in God. And where she fought the fight with cancer, she never ever skipped a beat with Brandon. If I taught Brandon one step, you can believe she taught him 2, 3, and 4. When we lost my mom, we lost a part of ourselves. And though Brandon was so young and didn't understand the concept of death, he did know that there was an absence. He did know that she was no longer there. It would be later on in life, as he grew, that it would actually hit him all at once. And when it hit him hard. One particular night, he just came out the room and he was crying. And I asked him what was wrong, and he said, "My grandma, she's dead." And it was that moment that he fully grasped what death and dying was. And so we had to grieve my mother with him all over again. Every day is hard, but that particular day was particularly harder. Brandon is still visibly affected by his perception of death. He doesn't want me to grow any older because he does associate growing older with dying. Brandon is the third child of 6. We made sure that Brandon knew that he was loved. We hugged him, we kissed him throughout the day. I couldn't even tell you how many times a day. But we did know that children with autism didn't really display affection. And I wasn't sure whether it was because they were uncomfortable with it or because they just didn't know how. So it was my mission to show my son that his mother loved him. And I wanted him to know that and be comfortable with receiving that love and also giving that love back.
I remember hearing my mom talk about how she felt the need to show me and my brothers that she loved us too because of the amount of attention that she was giving Brandon. But I didn't feel like she didn't love me. I knew that Brandon needed her, and I knew that he needed that attention, and I knew that he needed us too.
It was so important to me for Brandon to know what family was and what the love of family was. It was important for him to know how to bond with his brothers and sister and for him to be comfortable with doing that. He turned out to be one of the most amazing big brothers in the world. Puberty, puberty, puberty. It definitely made its mark on my house. Puberty was especially hard for Brandon because he already had these different challenges going on with him associated with autism. And then came these new feelings that he had never felt before, along with the different developments, with his body. And I had really considered possibly putting him on a low dose medicine to help him cope. But because Brandon is easily redirected, I was able to talk him through puberty and help him understand exactly what was going on and the things that we could do to help him through. Brandon is now 17 years old and a senior in high school. I look at Brandon and I am overwhelmed with joy and pride. And I often think of my mother and how I just want to scream to the heavens and tell her, Mom, he made it. Our baby made it.
My name is Brandon Henderson. I'm 17 years old. As I have autism, and that means I am a special gift from God. I was nailed in shaking thrill. I chasing the memory of it still, of every chill. Charted by the silence of a hushed blind, blind to the purpose of the brute divine. But you were mine, staring in the blackness and some distant stars. The thrill of knowing how long we are, I know we are. To the world and to the both of us, I confess in the long and I was dreaming of some better love, but there is no better love. The beggars above me, there is no better love. That ever has loved me, there is no better love. Darling, feel better love. Feel better love.
This year has been a very memorable year, to say the least. Brandon had the wonderful opportunity of representing his class for 2020 as Mr. Unique. He also sang in the coronation a rendition of A Whole New World by Peabo Bryson. Brandon's transition into adulthood does have me a bit anxious. When we first found out about Brandon, one of my first thoughts was, oh my goodness, what if something ever happens to me? And I know that his sister is here. I know she loves him, and I know she will take care of him. But I'm always what ifing, and it's like, what if something happens to her? So I'm always worried about what will become of Brandon in my absence and in her absence. So we've been working with him his whole life with the ultimate goal for him to be able to take care of himself with minimum supervision. As Brandon graduates high school, he closes one chapter to open another.
I wanted to become an artist.
Brandon has expressed that he wants to be an artist. He does have a passion for it and a natural talent that I would love to further develop. I don't know where we'll go from here at this point, but if I had the resources, I would without hesitation relocate to a place with resources that could help with further developing Brandon to his highest level of functioning. My life isn't just centered around Brandon. Brandon is my life. The love a mother has for her special needs child is a special kind of love. And it has been an honor and a privilege to love Brandon these 17 years of his life. And I ask God that he blesses us with many more.
When you're weary, feeling small, when tears are in your eyes, I will dry them all. I'm on your side. Oh, when times get rough and friends just can't be found, like a bridge over troubled water, I will ease your mind.